So my talk today, actually sitting here and listening to these two papers by my colleagues, I got an enormous feeling of deja vu, literally, because you're going to see some of the same pictures you've already seen. And my basic point was double. I was going to talk about decontextualization and typification. So you've already heard my talk. And I'll just give you examples with the work that I deal with in photography. And let's see if I can. Ooh, it'll be a little tricky to work this, but this I want to. Before we go on, I want to point out this little guy is Mungo Martin, who identified many of these people. Okay, we've heard about the book with the many illustrations, and there's some of them. And we also know that this was published by the U.S. National Museum as an annual report. One point I want to start with is that this was published in 1897. The 1890s was the great age when the genre of illustrated ethnography was invented in America, with the use of, I mean that more particularly with the use of photographs, because the halftone technology had just been introduced around 1890. So anthropologists in the 1890s tried to figure out how to do this. And of all the many volumes that come out, Boas is probably the best, the biggest, and the most complex example of that. So it's really creating the genre. To put this in a institutional comparison, it was published by the Smithsonian, by the U.S. National Museum as an annual report, and of course, as we heard, he was asked to illustrate the object collection. Oh, I know. I'm just going to sort of point at this kind of thing. So the interesting thing is that the anthropology was also done at the Smithsonian by the Bureau of American Ethnology. They're the ones that went into the field and brought the objects back to where they ended up in the museum with a different cast of characters. And they both published annual reports. This was published as a museum report. The interesting thing is that Boas himself, although he wasn't part of the Bureau, he was an ethnographer with field experience. He took his own photographs in the field, and when he published this book, it's essentially a synthesis of these two traditions of Smithsonian anthropology. Boas used the camera from his very first field trip to Canada, Baffinland, in 84, 85. He did that because he was trained as a physicist. And as a physicist, he brought a whole slew of tools, mechanical devices with him, because he knew that he needed these tools to record the physical world. And photography, cameras were just one of those devices. But actually, he had an enormous, of course, Northern Canada is not the best place to use glass plate photography, but he had a lot of trouble, and it kind of discouraged him. So then when he went in future years to British Columbia, he tended to leave the photography to professional photographers and not do his own photography. Ooh, what did I? Oh no. Okay. Yes, the plates. Now we'll talk about the volume itself. And this is what we've got: the 51 halftone plates. 20 of them, actually, I've been thinking of field photographs, and we know that many of the illustrations are line drawings of artifacts, but 20 of the halftone plates are actually artifacts, museum artifacts. One is a painting of a dance scene, one is the display. So that leaves 29 that look like they were taken in the field, but apparently. So here we've got the artifact, the painting, and I'll get back to some of these, and the diorama. And then these are kind of puzzling. These are, we don't quite know where these were taken. There's a suggestion of grass there, environment, but they are artifacts, so hard to know what to do with them. Just briefly, Aaron talked about these drawings as objects, representations of objects. I've looked at them as illustrations, and when you're talking about the photographs, you must relate them to all of these as you go page by page, but I'm not going to say much about these. These, though, I think we don't quite know the sources of them all. Some were clearly based on photographs. I think most of them were drawn in the museum by professional museum illustrators with the object right in front of them. But in some cases, they were based on photographs, and that's a very famous photo from Alert Bay. And you know, this is very close, very similar. There are very few changes, and you kind of wonder why this was done. I don't know all the answers that I'd like, but I do know there's a letter from Otis Mason, who was putting this book together, to Boas, and he says, in some cases, we're going to have to redraw the photograph because we can't reproduce the photograph with enough detail. So we know that was a clear reason for often doing it. Now, moving to the photographic sources for this book that I'm looking at, we've heard about the 1894 visit to Fort Rupert, so I won't need to belabor that. But the collection was split between the Smithsonian and the American Museum, and almost all the photographs in the book that we're talking about are from the Smithsonian National Museum collection, not from the American Museum. And the American Philosophical Society it's that one picture that we know of George Hunt's family and Boas, and there were many more pictures, or relatively more pictures, of the Hunt family, and they don't survive in a museum or archive collection. And I always assume they were given directly to the Hunt family, and we've got to talk to the Hunt family because I really hope that they're still there and we can find them, bring them together. There we go. This is kind of poor illustrations, but just to give you an idea, the picture at the very far corner there is Boas's original list of the photographs that he took in as he was taking them in Fort Rupert. And then when he came back to the East Coast, he split the collection and he worked with both museums at the Smithsonian and the American Museum of Natural History, and he gave each of them a list of the negatives that he had donated to them, and they each made copies of the photos that the other museum had, so that you theoretically could put all the sets together. What we do know when we look at all this is that there were actually three sources, and this is what everyone's been talking about, how the ethnographic sources have been obscured. So the bulk of the photos, indeed, were taken by Oregon C. Hastings in 1894. Interestingly enough, he was a professional photographer in Victoria, and Boas had worked with him in the 80s. And interestingly enough, he is the only photographer who's mentioned by name anywhere in this book. So every photograph you see, you assume Hastings took, especially if it's a picture of, you know, an Indian village, but that's not nearly the case. So the great discovery that we had years ago, as you know now, that many of the photos were taken in Chicago, not in British Columbia at all. And one of my most recent discoveries was that photo there at the end is, I think that's the only other photo from British Columbia that was not taken at Fort Rupert, and it was taken in Knight Inlet. Now the question is who took it and how did Boas get it? Visually, it looks to me like it was taken by Richard Maynard in 1873, but it actually could have been taken on a later trip by Hastings himself in 1879. So this book is way more complicated and kind of disguised than we've ever thought. In terms of the subjects of the book, not so much the corpus that it's based on, is these, I see we've made the switch here in formatting. This is ceremony and monumental sculpture and landscapes and portraits. So these are the main subjects of the book, of the illustrations. And they all, actually this looks like a scene in nature. It's actually a place where the Hamatsa initiates meet together. So this is actually culture, although it looks like nature. So every one of these photographs has something to do with ceremony, actually. They're not just people. The part that photographs that Boas took that he didn't use at all in this book are these many, many pictures of human head forms, physical types, and then pictures of cedar crafts, which was commissioned by the American Museum of Natural History for their own diorama. That's not in this book. It's in actually both of these kinds of pictures are in later publications. Now, so with that as an introduction, I'm going to finish by talking about two main forms of decontextualization and typification, sequences and series, and repaintings, retouchings. So this is fascinating. Now, one of the great contributions of this book is being based on many sequences, successive photos that were taken in the field. And then when Boas came back to New York to write this up, he selected from those multiple linked photographs to make a visual argument, a narrative, visual narrative in the book. And it's just fascinating. I don't have time to go into all the details, but it's fascinating when you link the photos in. These are just the way they appear in the series, in the book. And then when you look at the captions and you look at the narrative and how they fit into that, there's a lot going on here that Boas is actually simplifying, quote unquote. So this is what we see in the book. And it all has to do with distribution of blankets and the purchase of a copper. But what Boas does not admit anywhere, which I found out by looking at the original negative list and the field notes, is that they're actually, that whole sequence of the exchange of copper, purchase of copper, and the blankets, there were actually two different events taken at 2 different days, more particularly with 2 different groups of people. So the first one was on November 25th, that's play date, on the Goskimo. Then this was the second time it occurred. More of the pictures come from the second series in November 28th with a different group of Kwakiutl people. And what's interesting, I don't have time to go into all the details, but this event actually it's a Boasian event. This was a feast that Boas sponsored. He invited all the people to his own potlatch, and he gave them apples. And then he said, well, since you're here at my feast, you can conduct some ceremonial business. So we know that from other documentation. Of course, it's nowhere in the book. But the most important thing is that these are 2 different events with 2 different groups of people it's all thrown together as if it's one event. And the same thing happened actually with the Hamatsa, the return of the Hamatsa on the beach. The place is sort of the same, but the dates are very different with 2 different groups. These both are based on multiple series taken in the field. Less photos for the Hamatsa than for the blanket exchange, but the same logic is applying. And one more kind of series. Those were series in time. They take place at different moments. This is a series of spatial series in space. So all of these plates come one right after the other in the book, and they're all in the same place or successive places on the beach, and they're petroglyphs. And the point here is that they represent different mythological creatures. So it's a different kind of a series. It's not chronological, but spatial. So yeah, now the paintings and retouchings, of course, now we've already heard a lot about that. Boas got this German wildlife painter named Wilhelm Kunert from Berlin, and I wish I knew more about this painting of the wolf dance. And it's, as far as I've never seen any source for this. It seems to be completely made up. Of course, it shows you the headdresses, the masks, and it's a very evocative scene. And of course, what we do know is there's no way Boas could have gotten a photograph of this. He has a very few photographs taken inside a house, and they're very poor, and nobody's moving. So the camera technology of the time would never have allowed a photograph like this. So the only way he could ever show this was to have a painting. So you can see in the corner, Kunert did about 4 photos for the book. And so the funny thing, like everything about this book, sometimes the photos are acknowledged and sometimes they're signed, sometimes they're not signed. Then we have captions, and the captions say from a painting by W. Kunert, and sometimes they don't say anything. So it's really difficult to figure out what's going on here. But that's an acknowledged painting. This one is also, see, it's signed. We know that that's a painting, but if you compare it to the original photograph, it's extremely close. And I'm not quite sure, what was going on here. One thing I did notice, this man here towards the end, in the photograph, he's got a light-colored blanket, cedar bark shawl, and in the bottom, in the painting, he's dark. So for whatever that, but sometimes they're very close, which is sort of helpful or encourages us. But sometimes they're not. And this, of course, we've seen this already, and this whole thing is in the exhibit, and it's fascinating. This is plate 10, and let's see, is this gonna, let's see, no, it's not gonna work. Anyway, I'll just point this out here. So here's this man here, and he's got his hand raised up there. This one, these are the guys that are in the back, sitting along this settee. The 2 guys at the pile of blankets, they're standing next to him, right behind the blankets. And of course, the houses in the back are taken from that photograph. So here's 4 different photographs that went into this very composite painting. and Kunert is making this up. I mean, it's an expression that he's sort of guided by Boas to put this together. This we've seen before. This is derived from, so what this is a photograph, which of course results in a line drawing, not a painting and not in a photograph. And this, of course, I still haven't found the original of this, but this is close. We now know that this picture of the Crane Memorial was taken in a museum. So this sort of grass thing going on was suggested, and it was based on a museum specimen. This one we've seen before, and of course, finding the original in Fort Rupert, we know this is not the same photograph because he's got his beak open in here and his beak shut in here. So now we know this was shot in Washington, and that's the floor of the museum. This, of course, so this is interesting because if you look at the plate, behind this woman, it's white. So where was this taken? This is the original that we found that we know was taken in Fort Rupert. And if you look at the top there, you can see she's standing in front of a blanket. And at the top is the house in Fort Rupert. And there are many other pictures that are just like this. So we know this was a series, something that Boas and Hastings were doing intentionally. And then when it came time to publish the photograph in the book, they've sliced that away and decontextualized it. And this, of course, needs no commentary. This is the fair, but we do have this intermediate stage, so you can see how it's being sliced off and focused on. And I'll just show you all the rest. And this one, we know was taken at the fair, but we haven't found the source photograph yet. But the people were at the fair, and the objects were at the fair. So the basic point here is decontextualization and typification, and Boas aligning the ethnographic specificity. So to conclude, I'll talk about what comes after this. This book, 1897, was Boas's most, not only was a classic in American anthropology, it was the most sustained effort that Boas ever did in encountering and making use of photography anthropologically. He went on the Jessup expedition 2 more years in 1897 and 1900, and he did not use photography himself, although his colleagues like Harlan Smith, who's responsible for that, did, and the American Museum published 1 thin volume of photographs. And then Boas, towards the end of his Jessup publications in 1909, did manage to publish some more of the photos from this series that he hadn't before. And as Boas went on, he abandoned photography even more so. The question is, why is that? There's really 2 reasons. One, he was very, as a theorist of ethnography, he was very worried about observer bias, that white people could describe a native culture from their own perspective and would not be able to understand how native people view their own worlds, which is what his goal was. So that meant if a white guy took a photograph, it's distorting. The other thing that goes along with this is that he thought, ultimately, when he left the American Museum of Natural History, he said that we can't base all of our anthropology on objects and the visual world, that culture is essentially symbolic and ideational. And the only way we can really get in that is by words, is by texts. And that's, of course, this is what Judith knows. And this is why he shifted to working with George Hunt for the rest of their careers. George Hunt writing out Kwakiutl culture in texts and in words. And because of that, you don't need photographs. So, oh gosh, what do we do? There. But, of course, Boas was a very important teacher and most illustrious of his students working in photography and visual anthropology was Margaret Mead with her husband, Gregory Bateson, in Bali, and taking thousands and thousands of photographs and publishing Balinese Character, a very famous fully visual ethnography, which really embodies the foundation that Boas laid out in 1897. And I will just close with this photograph, this plate, that you can see. There's the caption that we find in 1897. It's rather minimal. And then below it, you can see what George Hunt did in later years. And not only do we have everybody's name and their translation, but we often have their ceremonial office. And of course, this was never published. And this is what's so exciting now with the critical edition, because anyone who wants to know anything about the Kwakiutl needs to go back to these kinds of sources. And of course, the biggest audience, the people who care the most about this, are the Kwakiutl themselves. So that's what the critical edition is meant to do, is to go back to these ancient archival sources and bring them into the present and into the future. Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple questions for Ira, and then we'll have our last paper before a coffee break. Right here in front.
Okay, and in many of the pictures you show coppers.
Yes.
Where did the coppers come from?
Oh, that's Aaron knows all about that. They were a ceremonial form, their counter of wealth and privilege on the Northwest Coast, and the literal material. There were ancient forms of copper, but these big sheets that everyone's holding here, they were from Western trade coppers, and the native people would fashion them into these shields. And then they use them as counters of wealth, and they would distribute them and such. So basically but they were, Boas talks a lot about them in this book, and he illustrates them in many photographs.
Yes,
There's a few in the exhibit too.
There was native copper.
There was native copper.
But they could never have beaten that into shapes that you showed.
Those were made from cheat copper from trade, but based on a pre-colonial form.
Yes.
And probably some of them from copper-clad ships.
That was the first form of trade copper.
Right. Yeah.
You have written on George Hunt's photography. So
Yes.
Boas stopped taking photographs himself, but would you say something briefly about Hunt?
Oh, yes. Well, yes. I had to be very limited here. Yes, I've written about George Hunt's photography. George Hunt actually got the idea. He saw all these people. His brother-in-law was a photographer. So he saw all these people with cameras, and he kept railing on Boas. He says, "I need to get a camera. I need to take my own pictures." And finally he gets a camera, and he takes his own pictures. And interestingly enough, although they're photographs, they're Kwakiutl. They have a native perspective, just as Boas hoped they would. George Hunt takes pictures in a way that no other white man did. So there is a native vision, a native eye, and George Hunt took pictures for years. There's well over 100 of them, and they pretty much all survive at the American Museum of Natural History. So yeah.
But Boas did not publish them.
I think he did publish one or two. Yeah, he did, because the food gathering pictures in the 1909 volume. A few, yeah.
Okay, one last question for Ira.
Just following up on that, how did those pictures by George Hunt differ?
He's met well. He's the only one that ever photographed Kwakiutl shamanism and ceremonialism. He also has pictures of the return of the Hamatsa, which are much more closer and again more in series and part of a whole. And then when he takes pictures of potlatches, which other people do, he's much closer to the ritual action than any white person is, and he photographs multiple potlatches in multiple places because he has that access, living in the village. Those are the main differences.
Thank you.
Ira has an essay on the book Anthropology and Photography.
Anthropology and Photography,
On
published
George-
by Yale University Press.
on
on
George
Hunt's
Hunt's photography.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Ira.
All right.